Have you ever felt like everyone around you is playing a power game whose rules you don't know? That hollow feeling in your stomach when someone gets what they want while you're still waiting for your turn? It's not a coincidence. Masters of power know this. Seduction is a hidden art that transcends romance to infiltrate every aspect of our lives. Today, I'm breaking the silence on a method the powerful have jealously guarded for centuries. If what you're hearing already gives you a shiver of recognition, hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to reveal could forever change how you move on this invisible chessboard. Machiavelli's forbidden manuscripts contain secrets that go far beyond the prince. Secrets that elites have used for generations to manipulate wills without raising suspicion. Get ready to discover the method no one dares to name. Niccolò Machiavelli walked through the dark corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stone as the powerful whispered around him. Few know that this man, relegated to history as a mere political theorist, hid within his writings a complete system of human influence that went far beyond the simple administration of power. What I'm about to reveal to you was written in pages that were never published, those the Medici jealously hid and that only circulated among the initiated for centuries. Machiavelli's true mastery didn't lie in teaching princes how to rule with an iron fist, but in something far more subtle: how to infiltrate the human mind without activating its defenses. Have you ever wondered why certain people manage to get everyone to yield to their desires with no apparent effort? Why some individuals, without possessing extraordinary beauty or obvious charisma, manage to make everyone dance to the rhythm of their invisible music? The answer lies in what Machiavelli called the silent conquest, a method that begins with a devastating principle. Most people live in a constant illusion of freedom, when in reality they yearn to be led. This is the first uncomfortable truth you must accept. Human beings fear true freedom because it implies responsibility. They desperately seek figures to provide direction while maintaining the illusion of autonomy. The forbidden method doesn't begin with action, but with strategic stillness. Machiavelli understood that true power never announces itself, never begs for attention. The first phase of Machiavellian seduction is to become a perfect mirror, a reflection so subtle that the other doesn't perceive they are being studied. During this period, the master of influence becomes an empty receptacle, absorbing every detail, every unexpressed desire, every silenced fear. Do you remember the last time you felt deeply understood by someone you barely knew? That moment when your barriers inexplicably fell before a stranger? It's likely you experienced this first phase of the method. The person who seduced you wasn't offering a genuine connection, but employing the technique of the receptive void, creating an apparently safe space to deposit your most intimate longings. The forbidden manuscripts detail how Machiavelli used this technique to win the trust of the Medici after being tortured by them. Imagine the power of a method that can turn your tormentors into protectors. This is the dark potential we are exploring, a potential that resides in understanding that people don't seek the truth, but confirmation of their own internal narratives. The silent conquest requires absolute patience. In an age of instant gratification, few have the discipline to master this first step. But those who succeed acquire an almost supernatural power, the ability to read others like open books while remaining indecipherable enigmas themselves. Are you starting to understand why this knowledge has been reserved for a select few? Most abandon this path upon discovering that it requires the temporary suppression of the ego. To become a master of Machiavellian seduction, you must first relinquish the need to be seen, to be validated. You must dwell in silence and shadow until the precise moment to emerge presents itself. Only then, when you have completely mapped your target's emotional territory, can you proceed to the next step of the forbidden method. The second component of Machiavelli's forbidden method is perhaps the most counterintuitive: presence through absence. In his secret writings, Machiavelli reveals a truth that contradicts everything we've been taught about social influence. The man who is always present loses value like the air we breathe. He becomes invisible precisely because of his constancy. This principle, so simple in its formulation yet so difficult in its execution, challenges our basic instinct to remain visible to those we wish to influence. The technique of strategic absence operates on a deep psychological premise. Human beings only value what they fear losing. When you make yourself omnipresent, you become a guaranteed element of the other's emotional landscape, as unremarkable as the walls around them. Imagine for a moment the void left by the sun when it hides behind the clouds after days of constant heat. Suddenly, its absence becomes more powerful than its previous presence. This is the effect we seek to create. After establishing a significant connection using the receptive void we discussed earlier, the master of Machiavellian seduction partially withdraws, creating a space of longing that is almost physically painful for the target. This withdrawal should never be complete or hostile. We are not talking about superficial manipulative techniques like playing hard to get. Strategic absence is much more subtle. It involves gradually reducing the emotional intensity you previously offered, creating a contrast that is unsettling without being obvious. The target will begin to wonder, what has changed? Did I do something wrong? The fascinating thing about this technique is that it operates directly on the human attachment system, activating the same mechanisms that shaped our first relationships with our caregivers. When the emotional presence that had become constant begins to fluctuate unpredictably, a primal anxiety response is triggered. The object of your influence will unconsciously begin to work to recover the connection, investing more emotional energy than they would ever have voluntarily offered. Machiavelli documented how he used this technique with Lorenzo de' Medici, alternating periods of close counsel with strategic retreats to his villa in San Casciano. Each time he withdrew, his ideas gained weight in the ruler's mind. Upon his return, he found Lorenzo more receptive, more eager to retain his presence and wisdom. Modern psychology has confirmed what Machiavelli intuited. Intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful form of behavioral conditioning. A guaranteed reward loses value. An unpredictable reward creates addiction. When your emotional presence becomes that intermittent reward, you generate a level of influence that transcends conscious reason. There is a critical point in applying this technique, a delicate threshold that separates mastery from crude manipulation. If the absence is prolonged too much or implemented clumsily, the bond breaks irreparably. The art lies in keeping hope alive while cultivating uncertainty, in being like the horizon, always visible but never fully reachable. Perhaps now you begin to glimpse why this knowledge has remained hidden. In the wrong hands, these techniques can cause considerable suffering. But in the hands of someone seeking legitimate influence, the visionary leader, the social reformer, the artist who wants their message to resonate, they become tools to overcome the natural resistance to change that we all experience. The third element of Machiavelli's forbidden method directly contradicts the image history has painted of him. While The Prince speaks of clinging to power at all costs, his hidden manuscripts reveal a much more sophisticated strategy. Power strategically relinquished returns multiplied. This is the paradox that true masters of influence have understood throughout the centuries. In the private chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, Machiavelli observed how the most effective leaders were not those who hoarded all authority, but those who knew when and how to relinquish it to create a psychological debt impossible to repay. This dynamic operates on a fundamental principle of human psychology. When someone grants us power over them, we feel an almost irresistible obligation not to abuse that power, and more importantly, to reciprocate with loyalty. Imagine the moment someone confides a truly compromising secret in you. In that instant, they are granting you power over them, the power to harm them. Paradoxically, this act does not make you a threat, but a firmer ally. Strategically revealed vulnerability creates a more powerful bond than any display of force. Machiavelli codified this technique as the calculated confession, the art of revealing apparent weaknesses that, in reality, humanize the seducer and create a sense of privileged intimacy. Observe how great leaders frequently share stories of their past failures, creating an emotional connection that no recounting of successes could generate. The most potent manifestation of this paradox occurs when you allow the object of your influence to make decisions that directly affect your well-being. Machiavelli wrote, "When you allow another to decide on matters that deeply concern you, you plant in their mind the seed of a tree whose roots intertwine with their own sense of honor. To uproot that tree would mean uprooting themselves." This technique was exemplified when Machiavelli, after his release from prison, asked Lorenzo de' Medici to decide whether he should continue writing political treatises or abandon his vocation entirely. By ceding this crucial decision, Machiavelli not only gained patronage to write, but transformed his former adversary into a defender of his intellectual legacy. The contemporary application of this strategy requires a nuanced understanding of the difference between authentic vulnerability and transparent manipulation. The power seated must be genuine. You must be willing to accept a negative outcome. It is precisely this real risk that gives the technique its psychological potency. However, the careful selection of what power to cede and when to do so is what separates the master from the amateur. There is an inherent tension in this paradox that few manage to navigate effectively. Ceding too much power too soon makes you irrelevant. Not ceding enough keeps the barriers that prevent true influence intact. The optimal point, what Machiavelli called the moment of inversion, occurs when you have established enough value through the previous techniques for your vulnerability to be perceived as strength. What's fascinating about this paradox is that it operates equally in personal, professional, and political relationships. The boss who occasionally asks subordinates for advice, the professor who admits not having all the answers, the political leader who acknowledges specific mistakes. All are employing versions of this technique, consciously or unconsciously. History is replete with examples where seemingly relinquished power returns multiplied. Caesar rejecting the crown to ultimately gain more power than any king. Great entrepreneurs ceding shares to secure unwavering loyalty. Spiritual leaders serving their followers to be revered as masters. The dynamic is as old as power itself, but its systematic articulation remained hidden in the manuscripts we are exploring. The fourth principle of Machiavelli's forbidden method delves into even deeper psychological territory, the alchemy of opposites. This concept, barely hinted at in The Prince, but extensively developed in his hidden writings, reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are irresistibly drawn to that which presents seemingly contradictory qualities. Machiavelli observed that leaders who kept their courts completely captivated were not the perfectly virtuous nor the absolutely fearsome, but those who manifested baffling combinations of opposing attributes. The ideal prince could show ruthless cruelty followed by sincere compassion, intellectual rigor alongside emotional vulnerability, absolute certainty alternated with moments of contemplative doubt. This dynamic operates on a fundamental psychological principle. The human mind constantly seeks patterns and coherence. When we are faced with a personality that doesn't easily fit into our pre-established categories, we enter a state of cognitive tension that demands resolution. This state, far from repelling us, traps us in a cycle of continuous fascination as we try to decipher the living enigma before us. Imagine for a moment the most influential person you have ever known personally. If you carefully examine their behavior, you will probably discover these seemingly contradictory combinations. The mentor who demanded relentless excellence while showing infinite patience with your mistakes. The leader who could be absolutely firm on fundamental principles but surprisingly flexible on minor issues. These combinations are not accidental, but manifestations of this alchemy we are exploring. In his manuscripts, Machiavelli detailed how to deliberately cultivate these complementary opposites. It's not simply about behaving inconsistently. That would only generate distrust. The art lies in genuinely developing seemingly opposing facets of personality and revealing them in contexts where they create maximum impact. The technique he called the dance of opposites consists of first establishing a clear expectation about your character, allowing this image to solidify completely in the target's mind, and then controllably revealing its opposite. The fierce warrior moved to tears by poetry, the rigorous intellectual showing exuberant passion for dance, the strict moralist confessing a particular weakness. Crucial to this technique is that both facets must be authentic. We are not talking about fabricating false personalities, but about allowing contradictory aspects that we all naturally possess, but which society has conditioned us to suppress in favor of consistency, to emerge. It is precisely this authenticity that differentiates Machiavellian alchemy from superficial manipulation. Machiavelli himself employed this technique masterfully. Known for his cold and calculating analysis of power, he surprised his interlocutors with moments of passionate idealism about the future of Florence. This combination made him an irresistible enigma to the powerful who sought to understand him, to determine whether he represented a threat or an asset. Modern neuroscience confirms what Machiavelli intuited. Contrasting emotional experiences release cocktails of neurotransmitters that intensify the imprint of the moment in our memory. The master of influence who takes you from laughter to tears, from certainty to doubt, creates a deeper neurological connection than someone who maintains a single emotional note, however positive it may be. However, there is a critical threshold in applying this technique. If the opposites are presented too abruptly or without a context that allows them to be coherently integrated, the target's mind will not experience fascination, but alarm. The art lies in revealing these contradictions at a pace that allows the other to gradually adjust their perception without activating their defenses. This alchemy of opposites explains why historical figures like Cleopatra, Napoleon, or contemporary figures like Steve Jobs generated such fascination. It was not simply their power or achievements, but their ability to embody seemingly irreconcilable qualities that made them gravitational centers of attention and influence. The fifth element of the forbidden method takes us into the most dangerous and potent territory, the invisible architecture of desire. Machiavelli understood that supreme influence is not achieved by satisfying existing desires, but by creating new longings that only you seem able to fulfill. This is the true alchemy of power, to transform another's will without their being aware of such a transformation. In the forbidden manuscripts, Machiavelli details a technique he called il vuoto significante, the significant void. This concept, a precursor to contemporary psychological theories, posits that human beings can develop intense desires for abstract goals that lack defined contours. The master of influence does not offer immediate specific solutions, but first creates a space of longing, a sense of lack that did not previously exist. This technique operates on a fundamental principle. Human desire is not a response to objective needs, but a product of carefully cultivated subjective perceptions. Think about how before the existence of the iPhone, no one felt the vital need to possess a device with those specific features. However, after its introduction, millions developed such an intense desire that they were willing to make significant financial sacrifices to satisfy it. The architecture of desire begins with the introduction of what Machiavelli called the unattainable horizon, a vision of possibility that redefines the present as insufficient. This vision should never be presented as a direct criticism of the current state, but as a gentle revelation of unrealized potential. You don't say your life is incomplete, but rather plant the seed of imagine what could be possible. Machiavelli employed this technique masterfully when, instead of directly criticizing the Medici's policies, he began to share stories about ancient Rome and its achievements. Without ever drawing an explicit comparison, he created an implicit contrast that made contemporary Florence seem diminished. Soon, the rulers themselves began to express dissatisfaction with conditions they previously considered satisfactory. The second phase of this architecture consists of what the manuscripts describe as the fragmented mirror, the technique of reflecting the target not as they currently are, but as they could be if they embraced the transformation you are subtly suggesting. Crucially, this potential image must contain authentic elements of their current personality, magnified and perfected. They must recognize themselves in this future self, but simultaneously feel the gap between both versions. The fascinating thing about this technique is that it operates completely below the threshold of critical consciousness. The target experiences a desire that seems to have spontaneously arisen from within them, without understanding that it has been carefully architected through indirect suggestions. As Machiavelli wrote, the true prince makes the people desire what he needs them to desire, while they believe the longing is entirely their own. The contemporary manifestation of this technique can be observed in everything from sophisticated advertising campaigns to charismatic leaders who transform initially apathetic followers into passionate devotees. The mechanism is always the same. First, create a specific existential void and then present yourself as the only bridge to its resolution. However, there is a crucial dividing line between legitimate influence and destructive manipulation in the application of this technique. When the architected desire leads the target toward genuine and positive development, we are in the realm of transformative influence. When it directs them toward self-destruction or unhealthy dependence, we have crossed into dark territory. Machiavelli himself established surprisingly clear ethical boundaries in his private manuscripts. He argued that the architecture of desire oriented exclusively to the benefit of the prince, without consideration for the well-being of the influenced, would eventually generate resistance and resentment. Supreme mastery consisted of aligning the implanted desire with a genuine benefit for the recipient, thereby creating a cycle of positive reinforcement. This perspective reveals a dimension of Machiavelli rarely discussed: his understanding that lasting influence must contain an element of authentic reciprocity. The desires we architect in others must lead them toward improved versions of themselves if we want to maintain our influence long-term. Otherwise, we are simply manipulating for temporary advantages, a strategy that inevitably collapses. The architecture of desire perhaps represents the most controversial aspect of the forbidden method, precisely because it blurs the line between free will and external influence. To what extent are we architects of our own desires? How many of our deepest longings have been carefully cultivated by masters of influence around us? These uncomfortable questions inevitably emerge when contemplating the power of this technique. The final and deepest element of Machiavelli's forbidden method is what his manuscripts call il patto non detto, the unsaid pact. This concept represents the culmination of all the previous techniques and constitutes the esoteric core of his system of influence. While the previous principles operate primarily in the psychological realm, the silent pact transcends into almost metaphysical territory, creating a bond that goes beyond words and explicit commitments. In essence, the silent pact is a tacit alliance formed when two people mutually recognize truths that cannot be openly expressed. Machiavelli observed that the most powerful connections between individuals are not forged through formal contracts or public declarations, but through the shared recognition of uncomfortable realities that society prefers to ignore. This pact operates on a fundamental principle. Human beings constantly live divided between the consensual social reality they must publicly navigate and their private perceptions that frequently contradict this official narrative. When they find someone who recognizes this duality without the need to explicitly articulate it, a deep complicity is established that transcends any conventional bond. Machiavelli documented how he used this technique to become the closest confidant of rulers who initially distrusted him. Instead of trying to win their trust through flattery or favors, he simply demonstrated through subtle observations that he understood the inherent contradictions of power, the necessary lies, the appearances that had to be maintained, the chasm between the public image and the private realities of governance. The implementation of the silent pact begins with what Machiavelli called oblique recognition, the ability to indirectly validate the other's unexpressed perceptions. You never say, "I know you actually think X," even though you publicly say Y. Instead, you make comments that would only make sense to someone holding that private truth. It's a metaphorical nod that communicates, "I see what no one else sees, and I don't need you to confirm it." The fascinating thing about this technique is that it operates completely outside the realm of what is rationally explainable. Two people united by a silent pact frequently couldn't articulate exactly what connects them so deeply. There is an almost mystical sense of, this person understands how the world really works, that transcends any practical benefit of the relationship. Machiavelli refined this technique into an art. He knew that the silent pact had to be built gradually, through small cumulative signals rather than grand gestures. A seemingly casual observation about human nature that resonates deeply. A strategic omission when everyone else is repeating acceptable platitudes. An eloquent silence in the face of a social falsehood that both recognize but no one else questions. The contemporary manifestation of this technique can be observed in transformative mentor-disciple relationships, unbreakable professional alliances, and even the deepest romantic connections. The common element is always the same, a mutual recognition of truths that exist beyond socially acceptable discourse. However, there is an inherent danger in forming these pacts. When established between individuals with manipulative intentions, they can become destructive conspiracies against the common good. Machiavelli was painfully aware of this possibility, and his manuscripts warn about the difference between silent pacts that recognize suppressed realities to operate more effectively within imperfect systems, and those that seek to exploit these realities for exclusively personal gain. The ethical dimension of the silent pact lies precisely in this distinction. Does the shared recognition of social contradictions allow us to better serve others, or does it merely grant us advantages to exploit them? Machiavelli argued that the first option was not only ethically superior but strategically more sustainable. What makes the silent pact so powerfully binding is that it creates a debt impossible to articulate and, therefore, impossible to fully repay. When someone recognizes your deepest truth without demanding that you confess it, it establishes a connection that operates outside the conventional economies of exchange. You cannot simply return the favor, because the favor itself exists in a domain that transcends ordinary transactions. Machiavelli wrote enigmatically about this phenomenon. He who sees you without demanding you reveal yourself has given you a gift you cannot name but will never forget. In that silent recognition lies the most enduring power. This observation reveals the almost spiritual dimension of the Machiavellian method that history has consistently ignored. Beyond the manipulative tactics for which he is popularly known, Machiavelli understood that supreme influence emerges from the ability to recognize the other's complete humanity, with all its contradictions, weaknesses, and uncomfortable truths. Do you feel that tremor inside you? It is the recognition of a power that has always been there, dormant under layers of social conditioning. Machiavelli's method is not an external technique that you mechanically apply. It is an awakening to the true nature of human influence. Like a scalpel in inexperienced hands, this knowledge can deeply wound both the wielder and the recipient. But in the hands of one who understands its true essence, it becomes an instrument of liberation. Those who do not apply these teachings are at the mercy of those who do, moving like puppets in a theater whose strings they cannot see. True power never announces itself, never begs for attention. It operates in the spaces between, in the pauses between words, in the silence that follows a revealed truth. If you felt that shiver of recognition as you listened, you are already part of an ancient tradition that transcends cultures and eras. Comment right now, "I see the invisible," and join those who have awakened. Next time I will reveal the lost manuscript that explains how the great manipulators of history applied these principles to change the course of the world. The decision is now in your hands. Remain a pawn or become the silent architect of your own destiny.